What's up, nerds? Welcome back. Did you just get a new camera? It's one of the most exciting things that can happen for a photographer, but pulling a brand spanking new camera out of the box and changing the factory default settings to the ones that will be most helpful to you in the field is overwhelming. Thankfully, over the course of my career, I've been fortunate enough to set up dozens of brand new cameras, and I have a pretty well-dialed system for the settings I personally like to change right out of the box to quickly go from new camera to my camera. Let's get into it. Now, if you're new to this channel, I should tell you that I am a Sony shooter, so of course I will be using my brand new A1 II, but nearly every setting I talk about in this video will apply to new cameras from any brand. And it doesn't even have to be a new camera, like right off the shelf. This can just be a camera that's new to you, purchased used from another photographer. Now, the first thing you'll see when you turn on your new camera is a prompt to set the language and then the date and time. When I was new to photography, I was always so excited to start using my camera that I skipped right past this step, but over the years, I've learned that this is an incredibly important bit of information to have written into your files. It helps organize all the shots from a trip into which day or time of day the shot was taken, and if you have multiple cameras you're using at the same time, it helps keep everything well structured in your catalog. Adobe Lightroom automatically organizes your photo library by creation date, so you're saving yourself a huge headache if you make sure your camera date and time zone are set correctly right from the get-go. Now, along those same lines, many cameras nowadays allow us to write photographer name and copyright info directly into the metadata of our files. Please take the time to do this. My photos are stolen and used without permission all the time, and because I have my name written directly into the files, I recoup nearly $5,000 to $10,000 in damages every single year from companies who have stolen my work. Okay, now that we have the boring paperwork settings out of the way, let's get into the fun stuff, the actual photography settings. The first one I like to change is from JPEG to RAW. I want to note that this change is not for everyone, as RAW files will require you to edit them and convert to JPEG before you share them, so if you're not interested in any sort of editing workflow, I don't recommend shooting in RAW. That said, I also don't recommend shooting in JPEG. You'll notice that in addition to a RAW/JPEG choice, there's also a JPEG/HEIF switch. HEIF stands for High Efficiency Image Format and is a much newer compression codec. It is fully lossless, so not only are the files smaller, which saves you space on the memory cards, the actual image quality is better than JPEG also. It doesn't have full adoption right now, but I almost guarantee it will in the near future. Now, along those same lines for RAW files, you get to choose between compressed, lossless compressed, and uncompressed. As you might expect, compressed RAW will make for the smallest files, but with a slight compromise in image quality. In general, these files will look the exact same as an uncompressed RAW file, except for very contrasty scenes with a lot of dynamic range, like astrophotography or sunsets with strong sky gradients. The perfect middle ground is lossless compressed, which saves file size, but is theoretically, as the name would imply, lossless. So the files retain 100% of their original information with a smaller file size, and so this is the option that I choose. Now, in this day and age, hardly anyone is just a photographer anymore, and taking video is considered more or less mandatory for social media, so I like to lock in my video settings right away so that the camera is ready for anything I need it to do once I get out into a shooting scenario. I set my camera to record 4K, and I like to film in 24 FPS as that's the standard for beautiful and cinematic footage. Lots of social media platforms display at 30 FPS, but by the time you upload to social media, the compression will be significant enough that the slight frame rate difference will be imperceptible. Higher frame rates like 60 or 120 FPS are good for converting to slow motion later, but they don't have any benefit if you're planning on sharing the video at normal speed. In this menu, you'll have lots of different options for the compression of your 4K footage, and this topic could be its own standalone video, so to keep it brief, I'll just say that bigger numbers make for better looking footage, but of course create larger file sizes. 10-bit video is better than 8-bit, but it makes larger file sizes. 422 is better than 420, but makes larger files, and so on. For video compression codecs, you again have your choice of file size versus quality. XAVC-S is the industry standard, and XAVC-HS, also sometimes called H.265, is a newer compression codec, so you'll get much higher quality footage at the same file sizes. XAVC-SI is the least compressed option of all, with file sizes nearly double that of the previous two options. This is faster and easier to edit because it's less compressed, but the files are massive. So the only scenarios where this format is super worth it are scenes with a lot of random motion like blowing snow or raindrops, where the compressed codecs will tend to struggle. For video, I also like to shoot in log, and on Sony cameras, the standard log format is called S-Log3, but for some reason in the menu, it's named PP8. Why does it say PP8 in the menu instead of S-Log3? That's because suffering is intrinsic to art, and if you're happy, your photos will be worse. They keep the menus confusing to improve you as an artist. Now, log footage is exclusive to video, and it will look super flat and bland on your screen, but it will give you the maximum editing latitude, so it results in a much better final image if you take the time to learn how to color grade. I also like to turn on Gamma Display Assist, which basically just allows me to preview what the final image will look like after color correction right in camera. I programmed this to a custom key so I can toggle it on and off while shooting in case I need to check my exposure and white balance. Long exposure noise reduction. I turn this off. With this setting on, every image you take will be followed by a duplicate dark photo of the same length, which doubles the time between shots. A 10-second photo takes 20 seconds. This accomplishes nothing that can't be done easily in editing, so all it does is slow me down in the field. Same with high ISO noise reduction. I also turn this off for the exact same reasons. Now let's talk color space. The default setting for almost every camera is sRGB because it's the most universally accepted color space, but it's also the smallest. Adobe RGB, also called Adobe 1998, has approximately 35% wider gamut, and since I photograph in color, I want as broad of a color spectrum as possible. This doesn't matter if you're shooting in RAW because you can change it during post-processing, but changing the setting in camera is just one less thing to worry about. Next, you get to decide how your camera manages memory cards. This is going to come down a lot to personal preference, but I usually like to have photos right to one card and videos right to the second because that makes the sorting and importing process easier when I get home. I also like to turn on the auto switch media setting, as this tells the camera to automatically switch to the second card when the first one is full, so you won't have to spend time swapping the cards around in the field and potentially missing shots. Now, if you're on a high dollar client project, it makes sense to change this to write both cards simultaneously so that all of your content is automatically backed up to both cards, and a card failure doesn't mean you've lost everything. Now, perhaps my favorite feature on these cameras is the ability to save settings to one of the 3 save slots. On my camera, I can save 3 photo settings and 3 video settings, so I'll make the number 1 slot be 4K video at 24 FPS, slot number 2 will be 4K video at 60 FPS, and slot number 3 will be 8K video at 24 FPS. So all I have to do to change resolution and frame rate in the field is turn the dial 1 notch rather than having to go in and open multiple different menu slots. For photos, again, I'll do a wildlife setting with faster burst and more responsive autofocus. I'll have an astrophotography setting with cooler white balance and a slow shutter with a delay, and I'll make a time-lapse setting with the intervalometer turned on. Again, it just makes the shooting process faster and more efficient. Being able to go from landscape photos to wildlife by simply turning a dial rather than opening 5 different menus is incredible, and it can mean the difference between getting the shot you want and missing it. Now, I do want to note that when you program these slots, it saves every single setting that you currently have. So even things like white balance and focus area will be locked in. So if you save your settings right now and then change a couple other things based on the second half of this video, those changes will not be saved in those slots. So you'll have to go back in and save them again. It usually takes me a couple tries to get these slots exactly how I like them. Next, I set my camera to electronic shutter. Mechanical versus electronic shutter is an endless debate in the world of mirrorless cameras, but I don't ever shoot under artificial lighting except for when I'm doing these YouTube videos. And also one time I got charged by a mother bear with a cub because the sound of my camera shutter startled her, so I always shoot silent now. Your mileage may vary. Speaking of quiet, I also hate the annoying beeping sounds that cameras make when focusing or counting down with the delay timer. So I turn these audio signals off for every single camera I've ever owned. This next one is a big time personal preference, but I love to shoot back button focus. So I'm gonna turn off focus with shutter and then make sure the back button AF on button is enabled. Grid lines, I love having the rule of third grids turned on. I frequently disregard them while shooting, but they're still a really nice tool to have as a baseline compositional assistant if I'm moving fast or need a little assurance. Sony cameras have tons of other grid options, including square, diagonal, or even golden ratio, and it's worth playing around to find the one that works best for you and your creative workflow. Next, I'm going to turn off the Dynamic Range Optimizer, or DRO. This basically just lifts the shadows and lowers the highlights so that the image looks better on the back of your camera, but it only affects JPEGs and the camera display and not the actual raw photo, so it can give you an unrealistic idea of your exposure, so I turn it off. Now, basically every camera has zebra display or dancing ants, and I personally love these. They help show which part of the frame is overexposed, which I think is super helpful for getting your exposure right in camera. The default setting for this is usually about 70 or 80, which to me is kind of useless, but setting it to 100 plus or even 105 plus if your camera allows custom zebras is fantastic. This way it'll only show zebra stripes for highlights that are so far overexposed as to be unrecoverable with editing. I leave my zebras turned on to this level for both photo and video. And speaking of on-screen assistance, I also like to turn on focus peaking for when I'm using manual focus. You can decide if you prefer low, medium, or high, but this is a very helpful tool for both photo and especially for video. Now there's a very cool new feature in this Sony A1 II that is not in many other cameras, but I'm gonna turn it on because I can't wait to use it, and it's called Focus Frame Display. It'll display a small green box on top of the image where the camera's focal point was when the photo was taken. This will be super helpful when culling images, as I won't have to zoom in to find the correct images with correct focus, it'll just be displayed directly on the screen for me. Now the next setting is specific to mirrorless cameras and does not apply to DSLRs, but I like to set the electronic viewfinder quality to maximum. Of course, this has the trade-off of eating through batteries faster, but to me that's a very reasonable trade because I want to be able to see what I'm doing through the EVF. It's very easy to carry an extra battery or two, but missing a shot because the EVF quality isn't set high enough is devastating. And now the last change I make is to program the camera to close the mechanical shutter when the camera is powered off. Unlike a DSLR, which automatically protects the sensor with the mirror during lens changes, lots of mirrorless cameras leave the sensor exposed. So telling the camera to close the shutter when powered off keeps the sensor covered and helps protect your camera so it's always ready to shoot. Now, as always, a camera is a personal tool used to create your personal art. There are likely settings that you personally want to change that I didn't cover today, and I really encourage you to explore those options and see what works best. I am constantly refining and tweaking my settings as well because I want my camera to function as an extension of my body while I'm in the field, but these changes are the starting point for every new camera that I get. Let me know in the comments below if there's any must-change settings that I missed. And until next time, stay nerdy.